Welcome to MAHZEN. Before we begin tonight's terrifying journey, take a quick moment to look around your room. Make sure your doors are locked and your windows are tightly shut. If you love true, bone-chilling horror stories and want to support the channel, please hit that subscribe button right now and turn on all notifications. It really helps a new channel like MAHZEN grow, and you won't miss a single nightmare. Now, sit back, turn off the lights, and let's dive into our first story.
When I was a boy, I was delivering newspapers early in the morning, long before sunrise. The sky was a deep, cold blue that comes just before dawn, and the street lights cast long orange shadows across the empty road. My route was usually simple: the same neighborhood, the same turns, and the same porches and mailboxes. I could do it on autopilot, and that morning started like any other. I tossed papers from my car window one after another, thinking about nothing more than finishing the route and going home to sleep. I turned onto a street I drove down every morning and saw flashing red and blue lights. At first I thought there had been a broken water main or a downed power line, but as I got closer I realized the entire street was blocked off. Police cars were lined up across the road, yellow tape stretched between them, fluttering slightly in the breeze. A few officers stood talking near the barricade, their breath fogging in the cold air. I slowed and rolled down my window. One of the officers walked over. He looked tired. "Road's closed, son," he said. "You'll need to turn around." I asked how far it went. "About 7/10 of a mile. All the way down." 7/10 of a mile? That was nearly the entire street. I remember staring past him trying to see what was going on, but all I could make out were the flashing lights in the distance and the silhouettes of more officers walking slowly along the road, looking down at something on the pavement. I hesitated but asked, what happened?" He hesitated in return and then said, "There was an accident." That's all the information he offered. I turned my car around and rerouted, but the whole time I kept thinking about it. A crash bad enough to shut down nearly a mile of road? That wasn't normal, not for this quiet neighborhood or at this hour. But by the time I finished my route, the sun was starting to rise. I went home and couldn't sleep. Something horrible had happened, I was sure of it. And it wasn't before long I found out what. It turned out that sometime during the night, a college student had been riding her bike down that same road, with no lights or reflective gear. She was simply a dark silhouette, moving through a stretch of road with no street lamps. And a truck came down the street. The driver never saw her. And worse, he never realized he hit her. From what the police were able to piece together, the truck struck her and knocked her under the vehicle. Instead of stopping, the driver kept going, and her body became trapped beneath the truck, dragging along the road as he continued on his route. He drove nearly 3/4 of a mile before he noticed something was wrong. By then the damage had already been done. That entire stretch of road, the one I drove down every morning, had been lined with not only endless blood spatters, but the debris of her own body parts. When I heard that, my stomach dropped. I couldn't stop thinking about how I had been there just hours before. I'd even driven up to the barricade without any idea what had happened in the darkness just a short time before. That night, someone rode their bike down the street, probably thinking about school or work or getting home. And then a truck came out the darkness, and in a split second her life was snuffed out. What haunts me the most is imagining the driver. How do you live with that? How do you find out later That you didn't just hit something, you dragged a human being down an entire road and never knew. And what about her? With no warning and no chance. Ever since that morning, I can't drive down that street without thinking about it. The officer telling me the road was closed. I think about how ordinary it all looked at sunrise. Sometimes when I deliver newspapers now, when the streets are empty, I find myself slowing down at that intersection, looking for a moment in the shadows, about how frail life really is, about how one moment you're just trying to get home, and the next you're gone. It really hit home, the fragility of life. Anyway, that's my story. Be careful out there. This happened in the mid-90s. I went on a road trip with my son, and for some absolutely brilliant reason, decided to take a different route home than the one I knew by heart. I figured a new road would be more interesting. Life needs surprises at some point. And instead, it turned out the new route was a long empty strip of nothing, a super desolate highway that looked like no one had driven on it in years. I chose to drive it in the middle of the night, so my kid would sleep and I wouldn't have to deal with traffic. And as you've probably anticipated, I wouldn't be sharing this story if something didn't happen on said road. So picture this. It's about 3 a.m, when my trusty piece of junk car decides it's had enough and dies on me, with no warning whatsoever. By some weird stroke of luck, I managed to coast almost directly into the parking lot of an abandoned roadside market. The windows are boarded up with warped wood, the sign is half missing, and steam is pouring out under my hood. In every way, it's the opening scene of one of those dumb girl breaks down in the middle of nowhere and gets chopped into bits kind of movies. And yes, that would be me, the dumb girl in the car. I sit there, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the low breathing of my son, trying not to have a panic attack. The road has been nearly empty for at least an hour, and I've seen maybe 2 vehicles crawl by in all that time. Then I see headlights coming around the bend. A truck goes past and slows down. In my rearview mirror, I see the reverse lights flick on. Somewhere in my head, the Deliverance banjo theme starts playing itself, all twang and red. The truck backs up until we're driver window to driver window, and I finally get a look at the driver. He's an old man who's just staring at me through the glass, like he is deciding whether he wants to butcher me or help me. At least, that's how I felt in that moment of absolute fear. He looks exactly like you'd cast him if you were making a low-budget horror movie with long, scraggly grey hair, grizzled stubble, and a worn, tired face. He motions for me to roll down my window. I decide that if I ignore him hard enough, maybe he will just move along. So I stare straight ahead and pretend everything's fine, with steam still boiling out from under the hood. Totally fine. He backs up a little, parks, and gets out of his truck, with a kind of irritated aura, if that makes sense, and he starts walking towards my car, and I'm thinking, okay, this is how my life ends. I wonder where they're going to find our bodies. He starts yelling through the glass, his voice surprisingly sharp. I'm not gonna hurt you, roll down your window. I keep my gaze drifting everywhere but his face, trying to give off a strong, no, you really don't want to mess with me kind of vibes, when in reality I'm about 1 step away from a heart attack. He gives me a disgusted look, like I'm being really unreasonable here, starts back his truck and starts digging around. I watch him in the mirror, my imagination going wild. He walks back with tools in hand, and my brain helpfully supplies every possibility at once. Oh great, he's got tools. Next step, he's gonna smash open my window, rip my teeth out, cut my fingers off, and dump the body in the woods. But instead of doing all of these things, he stops in front of the car and yells to open the hood. I keep avoiding his eyes, hands glued to the steering wheel. He says it again. His voice is getting sharper and angrier, but the fear and tone of the pure annoyance finally shoved my hand into motion, and I reach down and pull the hood release. Heart knocking against my ribs, he lifts the hood, and I sink down into my seat, and I can watch him through the narrow gap between the hood and the windshield. For a second he looks up, and our eyes meet through that little strip of space, as I almost die from the intensity of it. Then he just looks back down and keeps working. He goes back and forth between his truck and my poor, streaming car a few more times, bringing more tools, a jug of something, and a couple of items I couldn't really make out in the dark. I stay in the driver's seat, listening to the clink of metal and the soft thuds, and after about 15 minutes he slams the hood shut. "Start it up." I turn the key, and the car splutters, coughs, catches, and settles. He nods once, like the engine has met his standards, and calls out, "Be careful, there are a lot of weirdos out here." Gets back in his truck, gives me one last tired, disgusted look, and drives off into the dark, like the world's grumpiest guardian angel. My car makes it home without another complaint, and later I tell my dad the whole story, every detail, including the tools and mysterious jug and the way the engine suddenly behaved. He pops the hood, pokes around for a bit, and finally says the guy had changed a radiator hose and probably topped off the coolant. My dad points out more than once that my chances of getting struck by lightning were probably better than my chances of some random man, in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night, just happening to be driving around with the exact radiator hose and the tools to fix whatever 10 years plus old foreign piece of junk I was driving. I still think about his last line sometimes, though the way he said it without even smiling, "Be careful, there are a lot of weirdos out there," I still wonder who exactly he meant. But all the same, I'm grateful he fixed my car, and although the situation was terrifying in its own right, that nothing truly frightening ever happened as a result. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of people who've experienced the exact same thing I did, maybe more. They just don't talk about it, because in the desert, especially under the cover of night, this kind of thing becomes normal. I'm a long-haul trucker. I used to run regular loads between Texas and Northern California. That route took me straight through New Mexico, Arizona, and Nevada, some of the emptiest, loneliest stretches of road in the country. With the heat in the southwest, I learned quickly it was smarter to drive overnight. I'd start around sunset and be done just before the sun got brutal, and that meant most of my miles were logged under the stars. And let me tell you something, I don't care who you are or what you believe in. Drive across New Mexico at 2 a.m. often enough, you'll start believing too. I was somewhere in the middle of the state, deep into the eerie nothingness between towns, when I saw another driver up ahead pull over, just standing outside his rig in the middle of the road. Naturally, I pull over too. Perhaps he'd blown a tire or had an emergency or something, but when I walked up to him, he didn't even acknowledge me, just stared up into the sky. I was about to ask what was up when I looked up myself, and there they were. Dozens of lights, hovering, some pulsating in blues, reds, and soft greens. They darted and danced across the sky like fireflies. I couldn't wrap my head around what I was seeing. Eventually, the lights began to shift. They organized into 2 straight lines stretching across the sky. But that's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The stars were gone. Where the lights were forming lines, there should have been stars behind them, but they weren't. Not a single one. And the shape it made was massive. Something enormous was up there, darker than the sky itself, bigger than anything I could comprehend, easily larger than any aircraft I'd ever seen. Honestly, the only comparison I can give you is the Star Destroyer from Star Wars, floating silently above you. But now imagine it's real. One by one, the smaller lights zipped into the massive object and vanished. Then this big thing faded, like something turned the opacity down until it wasn't there anymore, and within seconds the stars were back, like they'd never left. I looked around speechless, and that's when I realized we weren't alone. At least 7 of us had pulled over, 3 more truckers had stopped behind us. A young couple in a silver Jetta had gotten out and was staring up, jaws open. For a while no one said anything. We just stood there in the silence of the desert, surrounded by engines idling low and the buzzing of the highway lights behind us. Later that night, I pulled into a TA diner and told my story to a group of old drivers. One of them said, "Yep, you've seen them now." Another said, "That's just New Mexico for you." A third added, "Don't bother calling anyone. No one listens. You're just another crazy trucker." Even the waitress chimed in. Her brother was a sheriff's deputy in the area, and she told me their department had a whole set of file cabinets filled with reports just like mine. Some of the cases dated back to the 60s, and long ago they'd stopped trying to explain it away. This was years ago. I've seen strange lights a few times since, but never like that first night. So are there any other truckers out there who have seen stuff like this? Because I know I'm not alone. My dad has been driving trucks for most of his adult life. Long hauls, overnight runs. It was usual for him to be weeks away from home at times. This must have been a while ago, back when GPS was only just starting out. He was hauling a full trailer across the Midwest, heading through to Indiana. Somewhere off Interstate 70, I think. He never liked stopping at big truck stops if he could avoid it. They were really crowded and quite noisy. If he found a quiet shoulder or an old pull-off where other drivers had parked, he would usually just go for that instead. So that night he pulled over a little before midnight. It wasn't an official rest area, but a wide stretch off the highway near a tree line. A few other truckers were parked further down, their cabs dark. So he locked his doors, closed the curtains and went to sleep. Nothing unusual at all. Bear in mind my dad is a heavy sleeper, and always has been. He can sleep through thunderstorms, passing trains, or engines starting nearby. Even heavy sleepers, I think, will wake up to certain noises. He's woken up before to trucks idling too close, or forklifts banging around docks. I mean, those sounds carry. They're loud enough to wake anyone up. So, this is what makes the story so weird. He woke up just after sunrise, and it was bright, too bright. He hadn't meant to sleep that much. He sat up and he realized why. The truck felt considerably lighter. The suspension felt different, and that's when he realized there was very likely something wrong. With trepidation, he looked out his cab window but couldn't see anyone, just the tree line. The other cabs that he had seen in the night were now gone, and he was alone. So he opened the door of his cab and made his way to the back of the trailer. The doors were still closed. There were no broken locks or bent hinges or visible damage. He unlocked them himself, swung them open and just stood there. The trailer was completely empty, not partially looted. Every single thing was missing. Floor to ceiling, wall to wall. Whatever he'd been hauling, whether it be electronics, appliances, packaged goods, he can't recall now. But it was like it had never been left in his care at all. To steal that much cargo would have taken time, organization, equipment. You don't just unload an entire semi by hand in the dark without noise. You need forklifts, pallet jacks, trucks to transfer the load, engines, backup beeps, metal scraping metal. It's a big operation, and as anyone could probably tell you, it probably should have woken him up, not to mention the other drivers parked nearby as well. But he didn't. That's the thing, he never woke up. So that in itself is why it's quite hard to believe. He looked around, but as I said, there were no other trucks nearby. He didn't know what to think. The police came, took a report, checked the lock and confirmed they hadn't been forced, and he asked the usual questions. Did he hear anything? Did he feel sick, dizzy, or groggy, or did he take any medication? That's when my dad mentioned something that he hadn't thought much about until then. He said he'd slept incredibly deeply. Normally in the cab, he'll wake up a few times a night, whether it be to move around, to go to the toilet, check the mirrors out of habit, but that night he remembered closing his eyes and then just opening them in the morning with no sense of time passing. He also remembered a faint chemical smell when he woke up, not strong enough to scare him at first, but it was unfamiliar. He'd assumed it was from the road or another truck. After the police left, the trucking company sent someone out, insurance got involved, the loss was written up as cargo theft, probably organized and professional. Officially that was the end of it, but my dad couldn't let it go. He kept replaying the same question, why he never woke up. Years later, after hearing stories from other drivers, he started to suspect something darker happened. He heard rumors about crews who used chemicals to knock drivers out, and this wouldn't be like in a movie, but it would be something they'd introduce into the cab while the driver slept to make sure they kept sleeping. He never claimed to know for sure. He never said he had proof, but the idea stuck with him because it was the only explanation that made sense to him. What scared him most, though, wasn't the theft itself. It was the thought that people had stood right next to his cab while he slept, close enough to open vents, close enough to touch the doors, close enough to hear him breathing. And if he'd have woken up confused or panicked, or stepped outside at the wrong moment, he probably wouldn't be alive anymore. He stopped parking on the shoulder and trusting pull-offs. He installed extra locks and alarms and anything that made the truck harder to approach without noise, and began trying to sleep lighter, and started parking in truck stops overnight. For my dad, this was the moment he realized just how vulnerable he was out there. It wasn't about accidents, weather, or exhaustion, which are all killers of truck drivers, but about the people who know the system, the routes they take, and when they are most vulnerable, and the perfect opportunities to strike. And how easily my dad's life could have been snuffed out had it been the will of those who robbed him.
Thank you for listening to tonight's stories until the very end. If these real encounters gave you chills, please show your support by hitting that like button, subscribing to MAHZEN, and sharing this video with a friend who loves horror. Now, I want to hear from you. Which of these 3 stories terrified you the most? And if you were the security guard in the final story, would you have looked up at the rafters? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one of them. Stay safe out there and sleep with one eye open. Until next week.